Beneficent, the Merciful, may his peace and blessings be upon his holy prophet and his progeny. Dear respected viewers, welcome to the conversation. Join myself, Daniel Pizer, and my co-host, Sheikh Yahya Seymour, as we discuss the daily challenges of converts to the religion of Islam and other issues and concerns pertaining to them. For today's episode, we are going to discuss the subject of what I call dual citizenship and dual exclusion. This is meant to describe the bind that converts are put into sometimes, where as part of the process of conversion, something that can last a lifetime in terms of challenges is the issue of reintegrating oneself as a holistic human being, I guess you would say, or a whole human being, incorporating both old and new, and adapting to a new identity, or at least a new aspect of one's identity. Muslim converts often feel that they occupy two different worlds, and sometimes suffer an amount of exclusion from both of those subsequently, and it becomes difficult or challenging at times to thrive in either of these worlds. How can they cope with this test, and how can Muslim communities welcome and support them? At the same time, do Muslim converts bear some special responsibility in terms of Islamic outreach, or are they in a unique position to carry out tabligh? And if so, in what ways? These are some of the issues that we'll be discussing today on the program. Again, with me is Sheikh Yahya. Assalamu alaikum.
Well, it's certainly an interesting topic, or series of topics that you've opened up. Some of them, of course, being very close to my heart, and I have no doubt that we will probably have to span a couple of episodes getting through the vast range of topics that have been thrown out today. In regards to every single one of those topics, I believe that they're all pretty close to my heart. I have my own unique thoughts on them, and also my own unique experiences on them, as you can imagine. I'll begin firstly with the initial concept of the transition between the previous identity in one's own personal Jahiliyyah. I think here is the apt word to use, and that is not to say that the person was in a ignorance in the connotation which we understand today, as in they were a stubborn, kind of ignorant individual who was ignorant of our cultures. No, but rather they had an absence of knowledge about Islam, and an absence of knowledge at the very least that Islam was the truth, and hence we're not following it. So when I use that term Jahiliyyah, I don't mean to compare any convert's individual previous life to the Jahiliyyah that we speak about in the pre-Islamic Arabian times.
And also a lot of the post-Muhammad Arabian times.
Yeah, and especially the I guess we could say the initial period after the martyrdom of Rasulullah. We're not talking about the Jahiliyyah of Saqifa or something like that. We're talking about the Jahiliyyah, namely the absence of an awareness of the truth of Islam.
Sure.
So allow me to begin with that topic, because I believe that this is of personal interest to me, because with reflection now, I, as someone who's now been Shia for about 10 years, Muslim for about 12, I can, with hindsight, comment on how I wish that I had this topic presented to me and had everything kind of weighed out for me, so I would be able to deal with things when I initially converted. Let it be said that I did convert at the age of 15 turning on 16, and therefore it's only natural that at that time I was somewhat young, overzealous, and I'm not surprised that someone who converted at my age but made the transition way too quickly, as opposed to in an organic and natural pace.
Do you think that I don't mean to interrupt completely, do you think there is an organic and natural pace or a comfortable pace we can achieve? Because certainly when you're talking about the time period in your life when you transition, I mean, in terms of shaping individual identity, those are really formative years. Even for myself, when I converted, it was comparatively much later in life. I mean, I was already in graduate school at the time.
Absolutely.
So the bulk of what is normally carried on into adulthood as one's identity was more or less already shaped at that point.
Sure.
So I guess what I'm wondering is, at either stage, it seems like a shock to the system to some extent.
Absolutely.
And how much of an organic way could we possibly achieve in terms of
Well,
of a
when I say
conversion
organic,
experience?
I mean more organic than not. So absolutely, you're right. If it were truly organic, we wouldn't need to be speaking about people trying to organize this. But what I mean by organic is people naturally in their daily lives make transitions. They make small changes here. They make changes in their lifestyle, changes in their ideologies, changes in their political views, in their social views, in their moral views. And those changes occur gradually. Unfortunately, when you might make as little as a confessional declaration, but I testify that there is no God other than Allah Azza wa Jal, and I testify that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi is the final messenger of Allah Azza wa Jal, and I testify that Ali and the 11 Imams after him are the successors of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. You are not only making a creedal statement, you are now openly acknowledging and embracing an entire way of life, worldview, which encompasses, to some degree, politics, morality, and other things.
And even daily practice. I mean, I remember being kind of the view that you have growing up, I don't want to say in Western society, but certainly in non-Muslim society at the least, or in a non-Muslim majority, is that religion is just that. It's another type of set of beliefs that you hold about the world and the way the world works.
In addition to your other beliefs normally.
Yeah, and it's something that is, in some cases, much easier in terms of accommodating a wider range of beliefs. Not that we don't see them as well within the Muslim world, but I remember being really rapidly realizing, let's say, that I had sort of jumped immediately into the deep end.
Absolutely.
And there's so much pressure to adopt everything so quickly. And I don't just mean sort of some of the cultural things that we may or may not feel pressured into, but in terms of you have to immediately start doing a lot of things in your day.
Sure.
Just learning the prayer and incorporating that into your day. I think for someone maybe who was either born Muslim or, more importantly, raised in a religious family, that maybe that comes naturally to them, and it's something they saw their parents doing all the time, and that they were always around. But for us, for me, that was a big struggle to incorporate that. Not that I didn't enjoy it, but it was not simple.
No, of course. With me, as I said, I was to some degree largely overzealous and had a real passion to jump into the deep end. I can relate entirely to what you're saying. For example, I remember when I first finally found some people who could speak to me about Islam, because I made this conversion process, but it was largely an online one. Then I sought out local Muslims in my community, in my city in Scotland, a very small one. When I found someone, it was 2 weeks before Shahr Ramadan, the month of Ramadan. And so essentially, people are busy, they have jobs, so you meet someone maybe once a week. I had 2 meetings with the guys, and they were like, it's Ramadan next week. And now I had to worry about what time do I get up, what do I do if this happens, what do I do if that happens. And instantaneously I was submerged into all these things. Now, of course, there was also this willingness for me to be quick to adopt the prayer. At that time, as I said, I followed a form of Islam which is not the original pristine Islam.
Sure.
And small things like we have a really long tashahhud in comparison to the one that we have.
Or at least the minimum that's normally mentioned in Risales.
In comparison to the one that's normally carried out by the community and mentioned in Risales, as you said. But they have a really long one, which differs from the minimalist one revealed by God through the Prophet. So
Sure.
I had to memorize that. And I can remember how intimidating it was. I was asking all the converts in the community, like, how long did it take you to memorize it? What, a month? Like, oh, that's too long, And I would do things like try and download MP3s and just listen to it over and over again to try and get it right, because I was constantly in fear that how long is my prayer going to be deficient for?
Yeah, exactly.
Then I memorized Surah Al-Fatiha long before converting, and I remember...
Before converting?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Um, Purely because I downloaded an audio translation of the Quran, which had both the Arabic translation and I found the Arabic recitation and the English translation, and so I used to play both. And so I remember how difficult a struggle this was, and most importantly, if I might just give some background to my own previous life, I'm someone who, whilst I certainly had very conservative views in some areas, was largely someone who was socially liberal.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a result, you're making this transition from being socially liberal to now relatively socially conservative. I do believe that Islam, as was revealed to the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as was revealed through the Ahlul Bayt to humanity, is largely, by today's standards, a conservative one. Yep. It's a conservative way of looking at things. It holds on to certain morality, believing it is static and objective, whilst the West is constantly moving towards a more subjective morality and saying that, look, these things which we previously believed to be forbidden, frowned upon, and something which should not be legal should now be legal.
Absolutely. There seems to be sort of a teleological trajectory for the West, right?
Absolutely.
That unfolds in a very specific direction, and you can watch that happening over decades, whereas in Islam, the emphasis is on maintenance of a specific social ideal.
That's not to say it's stagnant.
No, it certainly can adapt to culture.
Things. Exactly. Now, so as you can imagine, I made the extremely difficult transition from those things. And when I say socially liberal, Islam does not encourage us to dwell into our previous mistakes, the previous sins we have committed, but this is merely for the sake of the benefit of the new converts, the benefit of the born Muslim population who wish to understand the poor convert and understand how to help them, namely he or her. I was someone who had experimented with drugs, for example, experimented with alcohol. Someone who listened to quite readily much music, we could say. And so overnight, you're told, well, that's haram, and that's haram, and that's haram. Alhamdulillah. We thank Allah that these things were made haram because many of us have seen the social detriments which come as a result of using such substances. But at the same time, put yourself into the mind of a non-Muslim. He may very well accept that alcohol is something that should be forbidden, especially when you tell him that the Quran acknowledges that drinking alcohol does have benefits to it, but that the harm far outweighs the benefits. He normally would, even most Western societies do agree with this, that drugs or something which are bad.
Sure.
Now it comes to the issue of music. The poor guy is going to be like, why music? You know?
Especially if they've grown up in church.
Absolutely.
I mean, even in fairly, let's say, more conservative churches, that's still a normal part of the service.
Absolutely. It's normally used as a means to bring people back to the faith as well. But I can give you sort of the Christian worldview on music, which is why it's perceived as being something great. When I went from that transition of not being religious to looking for my purpose in life, I attempted to go back to my family tradition of Christianity. And in that phase, I realized that according to a Christian worldview, music is something that's praised. Why? Because they believe that we are created in the image of God, and that God's nature is to be creative. He creates. And therefore they encourage things like art, paintings, music, and all that stuff. So now from their background, they're going to be thinking, what the hell? You know, music is forbidden. Art is forbidden. So many things are forbidden.
Well, to be clear, I mean, not all, maybe, I don't know in terms of like Salafi schools of thought, other things like this, not all art per se, but certain forms of art, definitely.
Even this is something which is open to disputes amongst the Maraja. But for example, I'm talking mainly about when I became a Sunni, which of course we believe is a deviated form of the truth, and we do not believe represents what Allah Azza wa Jal necessarily revealed. They would say things like art is, especially depicting anything that lives.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this in and of itself is an interesting fiqh discussion which could be going into at another time, but yeah.
I think when I come back to my comment about jumping in the deep end, I think to a large extent, many converts do that. I think what we don't always realize is how deep the deep end is.
Yes.
You know, and that's kind of what I'm getting at when you are talking about how quickly you felt like you had to adopt specific things and at the same time give specific things up. And frequently things that are in Western society, for better or worse, kind of fairly interwoven with its fabric. I don't necessarily mean drug use or other things like that, but certainly drinking, and I know in the UK pub culture is something that's even more of a big thing than in the US, I think, to some extent. But certainly the amount that you feel that you need to cut out, and sometimes the pressure that you get from others to rapidly cut out things, that's can be an incredibly extreme transition, especially when you're not given useful replacements for those things.
Sure.
You know?
Sure.
Okay, so with all this time that I have now,
Yeah.
now that I've essentially stopped 50% of my life and
Yeah.
75 or 90% of my social activity,
Oh man, well,
now what?
I thank God I'm not from an Irish background like you, or I've been far more entrenched in such behavior. But
I'll give you an interesting story about that later.
Sure.
So please continue, though.
Back to that topic, though, as you said, we seek an alternative. We seek a remedy to the problem we now find ourselves in, which is a vacuum of time. We find ourselves in a vacuum of time that we have nothing to do in. And most new converts are so entrenched in reading anyway that they need something to do as an exception to the rule. Reading becomes the rule, they need something to do to fill that time.
Sure.
With me, as I said, the main problem I encountered was giving up the music. And as a result, I would search for the Islamic alternative to music, namely anashid.
Yeah.
And it was like, if I were to describe the feeling that a non-Muslim might have, observing this from outside my situation, he would describe it as going from appreciating, to give an example, Da Vinci's portraits to walking into a modern art museum, And these nasheeds are often catered for children. They're often in order to teach children certain basic forms of doctrine,
Values,
things like that. And so often you can't even relate to them as someone who's now beyond the age of preschool or primary school. And it's extremely frustrating because what are you meant to listen to instead? Especially since it takes up a massive chunk of our daily lives. Now, of course, no one has told me that, there's a massive emphasis at this time on listening to the Kitab of Allah. No one had told me that there's a massive emphasis on listening to, for example, the du'as of the Ahlul-Bayt. Of course, I wasn't even Shia at that time, so I wasn't familiar with the du'as of Ahlul-Bayt. But my advice to the new convert who finds himself as someone who previously appreciated music is to download the Quran and download the du'as of Ahlul-Bayt, and not to waste their time with the whole new Islamic media of English nasheeds or latmiyas, because often, if you want a replacement for music, they're not going to be suitable.
With that, we're going to go to a break for a moment. Inshallah, you'll continue to join us. And thank you again for joining us. When we left off, we were discussing the issue of integrating into Islam in terms of the new convert and adapting to, shall we say, a new identity, or at least integrating aspects of that identity, of Islamic identity, into our lives, and the pace at which that happens and some of the stumbling blocks along the way. When we left off, you were speaking about sort of the way that converts frequently try to substitute things in their lives, because we're left with this giant black hole of time. And it's exacerbated, I think, in part, not just in our personal time, but the fact that our social time may change
absolutely.
so radically. I do want to come back and talk about that particular part of it, but first I want to continue with where you were going in terms of this issue of finding sort of, we would say, like halal substitutes for
Sure.
things.
I guess we could say that sometimes we as converts, we overburden ourselves too by trying to rid ourselves of numerous hobbies which might not even be considered haram from an Islamic jurisprudential standpoint. So, for example, I myself, I was primarily a large fiction fan, both in terms of movies, TV series, and even literature.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried my best to cut those out and replace them by watching just lectures. reading
No
books
Iranian
about-
serials?
I'm not a big fan of the Iranian serials, especially the whole depiction of prophets. I find it to be something which, sadly, I've always had this thing from the past that when I get an image of an actor in my head, even I used to have this with movie portrayals of well-known novels, I hate to have the image of the actor in my head when I'm reading something.
I see
Let
what you mean.
alone something like Holy Scripture,
Yeah,
where you have prophetic figures. You don't want to have the face
Charlton
of...
Heston, or
Exactly. You don't want Charlton Heston as Moses.
although there could be worse faces, probably.
There could be. There could be. Or Russell Crowe as Noah, for example.
Sure.
But moving back to that point, as a result of overburdening myself for doing so, and not finding, well, you're not going to find anything in English, literature-wise, which stems from Muslims. The only Muslim literature I found in English has been quite possibly the worst literature I've read.
Do you mean translations, or do you mean things originally written in the English language?
Things originally written in the English language. People who try and pass themselves off as novelists tend to have a lack of experience. They haven't studied literature. They don't have a familiarity with literature. The things which I try to replace in terms of television series were often just, either would be produced by really liberal Muslims and it was just making fun of Islam, like Little Mosque
Really?
on the Prairie, for example.
See, I didn't have as much of a problem with that. I felt like, at least in the Western context,
Yeah.
that even though it frequently promoted a more liberal image
Yeah.
of Islam, and in particular, it only presented Sunni Islam, right?
Yeah.
That in and of itself was problematic, but in terms of something that you would watch as like a family time sort of TV show or other things, it's certainly less problematic than...
The acting is...
Yeah, okay, it's not perfect, but...
It's like your B movies and B serials you get out there.
They act better than I can, let me put it that way.
Sure.
Not saying much, probably.
Sure, that's the reason why you haven't hired an agent and put forward your services for acting for serials.
Remind me to talk to you about that after the program. But do you not find it somewhat problematic when we talk about substituting things that a lot of these things are in foreign languages, so we're not going to be able to necessarily understand or appreciate them?
Absolutely. And if we could just move on to this topic here as well, another thing that really frustrates me is the whole way that... So, for example, I talked about how converts might not be familiar with certain things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I personally have very good reasons for why I believe music is detrimental to human being. But I don't go around marketing those as the reason for why music is haram.
Yeah.
Likewise, I found that when I converted, we had a whole movement coming from popular, largely Sunni, apologetic literature, stating that pork is haram, for example, because pigs have been discovered to have tapeworms inside of them, and they eat their own feces, and so on and so forth.
Sure. I remember hearing this constantly when I, before and after, even till today, I hear this about how pigs are really filthy animals.
Yes.
Right. If you've grown up actually in rural communities, you see that as far as animals go, and definitely as far as farm animals go, that if left to their own devices, pigs are actually one of the cleanest animals.
Wow.
I mean, even rolling in mud, this is something they do for cooling purposes. It's not because they...
They don't sweat, I believe.
Yeah, I don't think they have evaporative cooling in the same way that we do. But for the most part, they are fairly clean. Even actually the dog thing is very baffling to a lot of people.
So, right. Well, again, here I have no problem stating that Allah Azza wa Jal has legislated that the pig is forbidden. Therefore, it is
Forbidden.
There's no need to market it to me with, it's because, you see, it's tapeworms. Because when you market this to the poor non-Muslim who's a critical thinker is going to come back to you and say, okay, so if we can replicate conditions in which the pig no longer has tapeworms, no longer eats its own feces, is raised in such a way where it is eating the cleanest of substances and is biologically cleaner than any other animal that you eat, will you now eat it? It'll be like, no. Why? I thought you said these were the reasons for why it was forbidden. Likewise with music. I will be told the craziest things ever for why music was haram. Now, I accept Allah Azza wa Jal has legislated they are haram, therefore they are haram. And we submit to by what Allah Azza wa Jal has legislated. All I'm saying is, these things, when you're trying to change the convert from his previous identity into an Islamic identity, are not going to help. It doesn't help to feed him cheap apologetic literature, which is designed to give Muslims a little tap on the back and go, oh yeah, okay, that's a really smart reason for why this has been made haram. And I just think it's detrimental, because when he finds out the truth, which is that, well, in reality, that's not the reason.
Yeah.
Because you built your religion upon a straw man, once the straw man's knocked over, he might choose to just...
Well, I wonder what else was wrong that I was told.
Exactly.
Actually, this is something I think occurs in a lot of areas. This kind of maybe jumps the gun a little bit, but it gets to the issue of the position of, or at least the perceived position of converts in relationship to tabligh and Islamic outreach within Muslim communities. But I think that sometimes people who are born Muslim or these community centers view, not necessarily wrongly, view converts as sort of the ideal vehicle for Islamic outreach. Now, after someone has been Muslim for a while and had a chance to sort of acclimate and deal with a lot of these identity crisis issues that comes up or other things, yeah, that's not such a bad idea. But I remember, I mentioned to you, there was this Wahhabi Imam that I used to see sometimes, right before and after I converted. And I remember him telling me once that it would be really great to have me, and especially if I could come back to that center, which I wasn't really about to do as a Shia. Yeah, but he didn't know this, so that if I come back to that center, because they set up a table to give out literature and things like this, and it's this thing called dawah, and it's really important, and you can help with this, and that people will understand when they hear things coming from you that they wouldn't accept coming from us. Mm-hmm. And then the examples he proceeds to give are about cutting of hands, stoning to death, other things like this. That he honestly thought that if some other, I don't know, indigenous white American heard of this or something.
By the time he'd spoken to you about it.
Yeah, to a large extent. So for him to then say that they're going to take that from me, even if we submitted that their position on this was correct, is really problematic. I mean, to that level, I would say it was a little delusional, actually. But yeah, I think to some extent this comes back to that issue. When we deal with the issue of time, I feel like we can actually spend a lot of time discussing that subject, but sometimes the things that are cut first by converts can be, first of all, somewhat damaging to cut out completely, and beyond that, not really necessary to cut out. So we find, especially in the area of social relationships, that this becomes really common, that you stop hanging out with your non-Muslim friends so much. And look, to the extent if you're trying to integrate into a community and you're spending more of your time there, fine. But it's also important in the process to be able to strike a balance, and usually I think, sadly, that takes a long time for a lot of converts, and sometimes when they realize they need more of a balance, it's too late. You know, I think it's important, at least for us, to emphasize that becoming Muslim doesn't mean that you're leaving everything behind.
Absolutely.
You know, unless you're planning on moving to a different country, literally, or something like that.
Well, unfortunately, I'm someone that fell victim to that. Before you move on, I wanted to just come back to what you were saying about this illusion that just because someone is somehow indigenous, they're white, they can sell the religion better than other people. And I'll give an example I encountered when I had first converted. Now I'm talking about a largely Sunni group here, but I believe the attitude is still dominant amongst all Muslims. We come from a particular group which is known for visiting people's houses and harassing them. We'll call them TJ for the sake of...
Took me a minute, but yeah, I know.
For the sake of political correctness. Largely a Deobandi offshoot group. I hope everyone who hasn't figured out what they're called has done so by now if we're familiar with them. I remember being at the mosque one day. I've been Muslim for about 1.5 years now. I saw a new white brother pray, and I could tell he looked a little confused, out of place. He prayed and he introduced himself, and his name was Craig, Scottish guy. And so next thing I know, the brothers are like, let's go for tabligh. And I used to just go with him because I'd have nothing better to do. I was sleeping in the mosque on those nights. So I'd go with him anyway, trying to experience what the group was all about. Then I saw that they had brought Craig, and I'm thinking, why are we bringing Craig? You know, I think he said the Shahada today. And they brought him along on the basis that he's white, and I guess I look too half Filipino to pass off as white. So I came along and we went to visit a brother, and then they were planning to open up a small dawah stall beside the university. And when they went to visit the brother who had not been coming to the mosque, they were concerned about him. Craig started saying a few weird things like, yeah, it's like when God came down in the past in the form of Amun-Ra and Osiris. And I was just like, brothers, I'm pretty sure we should have taken Craig to the side and just made sure that he understood what Islam was before we decided to take him out on these things. And so this is just the danger of taking someone who's literally just come in and said the Shahada, doesn't know anything about the religion, taking him and placing him in a position in which he's being expected to answer questions, despite the fact that he has zero knowledge.
So we're dealing with the subject of too much too soon, essentially.
Absolutely.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time for this episode. We're going to have to continue it in the next episode of The Convertsation. Thank you again for joining us. Once again, our email address and information should be posted on the screen. Please feel free to contact us with any questions, concerns, or queries that you have. In the meantime, please take care of yourselves. May God bless you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.